It was 2 a.m. The entire city hall was completely silent. No officers. No managers. No powerful people walking through those grand halls with their expensive suits and their confident steps. Just one man, a mop, a bucket, and the kind of silence that only exists when the whole world has gone to sleep and forgotten you exist. He moved slowly through the marble hallways, the sound of his mop the only thing echoing in that massive, empty building. The same hallways where tomorrow the most important people in the city would walk without a second thought. The same floors he had cleaned 10,000 times before, and he would clean them again tonight. Just like always, just like nobody was watching, because nobody ever was. He had worked at City Hall for 11 years. 11 years of showing up before the sun rose and leaving long after it set. 11 years of being the first one in and the last one out. 11 years of cleaning up the coffee spills, the cigarette ash, the crumpled papers thrown carelessly on the floor by men who signed documents that changed thousands of lives. He never complained. He never asked for anything. He just showed up, did his work, and disappeared back into the darkness like he was never there at all. The receptionists never said good morning to him. The managers walked past him like he was part of the wall. The lawyers, the politicians, the senior officers, they all moved through those halls with purpose and importance, and not one of them ever once stopped to look at his face. Not once in 11 years did anyone ask him his name. He was not a person to them. He was just the man who made the mess disappear. There was one evening he still thought about sometimes, late at night when the silence got too heavy. He had been mopping near the elevator when a senior officer walked out, phone in hand, moving fast. He had smiled, a small, quiet smile, the kind that costs nothing to give. And he had said a simple hello. The officer did not slow down, did not look up, did not even blink, just walked straight past him like he was a ghost standing in the hallway. And he stood there for a moment, smile slowly fading, and then he looked back down at the floor and kept mopping. That was the moment he understood something. Not with anger, not with bitterness, just with a quiet, aching sadness that settled into his chest and never fully left. He understood that, to the world around him, he simply did not exist. But here is what that world never knew. Every night, after his shift ended and he walked out of that building into the cold, dark air, he did not go home to rest. He walked 20 minutes to a small apartment at the edge of the city. One room, one bed, a single window with a long crack running down the glass that let in a thin whistle of wind every winter. The walls were bare. The ceiling had a water stain in the corner that had been there since he moved in. It was the kind of place that the world builds for people it has already decided do not matter. But in the corner of that small, forgotten room, covered carefully with an old bed sheet, was an upright piano, scratched and worn, with keys that had yellowed at the edges and 2 pedals that stuck slightly when pressed. He had found it 15 years ago, sitting outside a building with a sign that said "Free to Take." Most people walked past it. Stopped. Something pulled at him in a way he could not explain. He borrowed a cart from a neighbor and spent 3 hours getting it up the narrow staircase to his room. His back hurt for a week after. He did not care. Every single night, no matter how exhausted he was, no matter how much his feet ached or his shoulders burned from hours of physical work, he sat down at that piano and he played. Not casually. Not as a hobby. He played with the kind of dedication that most people reserve only for the things they love more than life itself. He had never taken a single lesson. He had never sat in a classroom or had a teacher correct his posture or guide his fingers. He had learned everything alone in that tiny room, in complete silence, year after year after year. And what came out of those tired, worn hands was something that had no right to exist in a place like that. The music was breathtaking, complex, emotional, technically precise in a way that trained musicians spend decades trying to achieve. When he played, the cracked walls of that apartment seemed to disappear. The water stain on the ceiling, the cold draft from the broken window, the noise of the street below, all of it faded. There was only the music, and for those few hours every night, he was not invisible. He was not forgotten. He was not the man nobody noticed. He was something else entirely, something the world had never been given the chance to see. Then one night, something shifted. He was cleaning the third-floor corridor, moving quietly past the conference room, when he noticed the door was slightly open. He was not trying to listen. He never involved himself in things that were not his business. But then a few words drifted out into the hallway and stopped him completely. 2 senior officials were inside, speaking in urgent, worried voices. He stood still, without meaning to. They were talking about the annual city gala, the most prestigious event of the year. Every powerful name in the city would be in that room. The mayor, the council members, the top businessmen, the press, and the headline act, a celebrated classical pianist who had been flown in from Europe at great expense, had just cancelled. 2 days before the event, the room was in crisis. One of the officials said in a tight, desperate voice that if there was no performance, the entire evening would fall apart, that the mayor would be furious, that years of reputation were at stake. He stood in that dark hallway and did not move. His hands had stopped on the mop handle. His heart was doing something strange inside his chest, something he had not felt in a very long time. He went back to work. He told himself to forget it. He told himself it was not his world and never would be. He told himself that a man like him did not belong on a stage like that. Men like him stayed in the hallways. Men like him showed up after the lights went down and cleaned up what was left behind. That was the role the world had written for him, and he had learned, through 11 long years of silence, to accept it without fighting. But that night, when he finally walked home and sat down at his piano, he could not play. For the first time in years, he just sat there, completely still, staring at the keys in the dark. His whole life seemed to be sitting in that silence with him. Every morning, he had arrived unseen. Every night, he had left unnoticed. Every note he had ever played had floated up to that cracked ceiling and disappeared into the air without a single soul to hear it. And now, 2 days away, there was a stage, a real stage, with a piano, and an audience of hundreds, and a silence that needed to be filled. He pressed one single key with one finger. The note rose softly in that cold, dark room and slowly faded. And in that one small sound, there was everything. Every year of loneliness, every morning of invisibility, every night of playing music for no one. He sat there in the dark for a long time, not moving, just breathing. Because somewhere deep inside him, in a place he had buried so carefully for so long, something was stirring, something that terrified him more than any failure ever could. The possibility that maybe, just maybe, he had been seen all along. The next morning, he arrived at City Hall earlier than usual. He told himself it meant nothing. He told himself he was just doing his job. But his feet carried him to the 3rd floor without him making a conscious decision to go there. The conference room door was open. The same 2 officials were inside, phones in hand, faces tight with stress. Papers were spread across the table. Someone on a call was saying the backup options had all fallen through. The room smelled like cold coffee and panic. He stood in the doorway for a moment, mop in hand, and something inside him moved before his mind could stop it. He knocked quietly on the open door. Both officials looked up. Their eyes moved over him the way eyes always moved over him. Quick, dismissive, already, looking past him before they had fully looked at him. One of them said, with barely contained impatience, that they were busy. He nodded. He almost turned around. His whole body was telling him to turn around, to go back to the hallway, to disappear like he always did. But instead, in a voice so quiet it was almost a whisper, he said 3 words. I can play. The silence that followed those 3 words was the longest silence of his life. One official exchanged a glance with the other, the kind of glance that carries an entire conversation in half a second. There was confusion in it, a little irritation, and something else, something that cut deeper than either of those. Amusement. Amusement. The older official leaned back slightly and asked, with a carefully polite tone that was somehow worse than rudeness, what exactly he meant. He said it again, steadier this time. He said he played piano, that he had been playing for 15 years, that he could perform at the gala if they needed someone. Another silence. The younger official looked down at the table. The older one cleared his throat and said they appreciated it, but that this was a formal event, a high-profile evening, that the audience expected a certain standard. He did not say what everyone in that room was thinking, but the words hung in the air anyway. Men like you do not belong on that stage. And who did Onse said he understood, and walked back out into the hallway. He went back to mopping. His jaw was tight. His chest felt like something heavy had been placed inside it. He had known this would happen. He had known before he even knocked on that door. And yet somehow, hearing it, without actually hearing it, feeling the dismissal without a single honest word being spoken, it hurt in a way he had not expected. It hurt in the specific, familiar way that only comes from hoping for something you were never supposed to hope for. He finished his shift, walked home, sat at the piano, and this time he played. He played for 2 hours without stopping. He played everything he had ever learned, every piece he had practiced in the dark for 15 years, and the music filled that small room so completely that the walls seemed to vibrate with it. When he finally stopped, his face was wet. He had not noticed when that happened. The next day was the day of the gala. He arrived for his shift as always. The building was buzzing with energy, decorators moving through the halls, catering staff rolling in carts. The grand ballroom on the first floor was being transformed into something spectacular. He watched it all from the edges, carrying his equipment, staying out of the way, invisible as always. By late afternoon, the place was unrecognizable. Chandeliers, placine, round tables draped in white linen, a grand black piano sitting on the elevated stage at the front of the room, polished to a mirror shine, its lid propped open like it was waiting for something. He stopped in the doorway for just a moment and looked at it. Then he looked away and kept walking. By 7 in the evening, the guests had begun arriving. He could hear the noise from the service corridor where he was working. Laughter, the sound of glasses, important voices filling the room with the comfortable sound of power, talking to power. He kept his head down and focused on the corridor floor. Then, at exactly 7:45, he heard something that made him stop. Hurried footsteps, urgent voices. He looked up and saw the younger official from the conference room moving fast down the corridor toward him, tie slightly loose, phone still in hand, eyes wide with something close to desperation. The man stopped in front of him, looked at him for a moment as if seeing him, truly seeing him, for the very first time. And then he said it. The backup they had arranged had just canceled 30 minutes before the performance. The room was full. The mayor was seated. There was a piano on that stage, and nobody to play it. He asked, with a voice that had lost every trace of its earlier dismissal, if the offer was still on the table. He looked at the man for a long moment. He thought about that glance the two officials had exchanged. He thought about 11 years of marble floors and empty hallways and good mornings that were never returned. He thought about that one cracked piano key he had pressed in the dark 2 nights ago in the lifetime of silence it contained. Then he set down his mop, and he said yes. They gave him 5 minutes. There was no time for anything else. Someone found him a simple dark jacket that was slightly too large in the shoulders. He stood backstage and looked out at the room through the gap in the curtain. Hundreds of people, every table full. The mayor in the front row, cameras positioned around the room. Crystal glasses catching the light, a world that had never once considered that he might have something to give it. His heart was hammering. His hands were trembling slightly at his sides. Every instinct he had was screaming at him to walk back out the service door and disappear into the night where he belonged, where he was safe, where he was invisible. But something else, something older and quieter and more powerful than fear, was pushing him forward. 15 years of playing alone in a cold room for an audience of nobody. 15 years of music that had never been heard. Tonight that ended. He walked onto the stage. The room did not go quiet immediately. People were still talking, still reaching for their glasses, still leaning into conversations. He sat down at the piano without introduction, without announcement, without a single word. He adjusted the bench. He placed his hands on the keys, and then he paused for just one breath. One single breath that held every year of his life inside it. And it played. And it played. The first note silenced the nearest table. The second silenced the next. Within 30 seconds, the entire room had gone completely still. Not the polite silence of an audience waiting patiently. Something else. Something rarer. The silence of people who have been stopped mid-sentence by something they did not expect and cannot explain. The music moved through that room like something alive. It was not just technically perfect, though it was that. It was filled with something that cannot be taught in any conservatory or practiced in any lesson. It was filled with loneliness and endurance, and all the invisible years and all the unheard notes, and all the mornings of being looked through like glass. Every person in that room felt something shift inside their chests without fully understanding why. A woman at the third table pressed her fingers to her lips. A man near the back closed his eyes. The mayor sat completely still, hands folded, staring at the stage with an expression that had moved far beyond surprise into something quieter and more honest. He played for 12 minutes. When the final note faded into the air and his hands lifted slowly from the keys, the room stayed silent for 3 full seconds. 3 seconds of complete, breathless silence. And then it broke. The applause started at the front and rolled backward through every table like a wave, rising and rising until it became something overwhelming. People were on their feet. The mayor was standing. Someone near the back was crying openly and not trying to hide it. And he sat on that bench, hands in his lap, staring at the floor of the stage. His shoulders were shaking slightly. Because after 47 years of being nobody, after 11 years of invisible mornings and silent nights, after 15 years of playing music that only the cracked walls of a small apartment had ever heard, the world had finally listened.